is a world-class solar and renewable energy scientist, innovator, expert. Rab came to us with a dream. He approached us and has a huge heart, a very similarly large and strong body, and an incredibly similarly enormous brain. So the combination of the three is pretty wild. Maybe they're somehow related to each other, but he's one of the biggest hearted, biggest muscled, and biggest brained persons I know. And Rab came to us with a dream, and his dream was to take, what is it, decades at this point, over a decade of high-level expertise in really a million things, including building and all kinds of other knowledge, but especially his core focus, which is solar power and green energy. And he came to us with the dream of taking his master's degree, right? In, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a master's in photochemical, yeah, solar to fuels, basically. Let's put
Okay.
it that way.
In that, I don't know how to pronounce it, and whatever he just said, he came to us with the dream of taking that and working for NREL, right? In Golden, which is a lab.
It's actually Flatiron's campus.
Flatiron's campus, which is a laboratory.
It's like a 300-acre research facility for grid integration.
Okay, and so essentially, Rab has now just the other day manifested his dream that he had when we found him, and been hired to do what his mission is, which is basically to create and invent brand new innovations in solar technology and renewable energy production, storage, conversion, use, etc. That goes above and beyond everything that we already have to make it better and better so that we can survive and thrive as a species on the planet. So Rab knows just about all I can think of that one might need to know about, well, I might not know much, but about solar and essentially what it takes for us to transition out of what I think he calls dirty power to clean, renewable energy via the immense power of the sun themselves.
Yeah, as Yasha said, I'm a solar engineer. I think that's the short version of it. A couple of different years, you know, right now I'm working on like fields of solar panels. And as Yasha mentioned, I recently got an offer at NREL, which, you know, looking forward to accepting, but it hasn't been finalized. For those familiar with the National Renewable Energy Lab, it's, you know, really excited about that. So in the top right picture there, that's me like back in 2013 at a solar concentrating furnace. It's like a 5-story tall building that's entirely made out of mirrors to concentrate solar power for high heat chemical reactions. So yeah, I've been doing solar stuff for a long time. And want to share what I thought could be a good summation of some of the things for this group, and keeping the sustainability and sustainable living frame in mind. But happy to talk to any topic during the Q&A. You know, I may not have expertise in everything that might be asked, but happy to chat through it if there are questions. And if I can actually, all right, so I wanted to just start with saying that there's, you know, different kinds of solar energy. There's photosynthetic, which is like things growing, right? The sun shines. As long as a little bit of soil, a little bit of water, and some sunshine, they can grow. And, you know, this is how we eat, right? everybody here is already using solar energy, so you can pat yourselves on the back. Because you're already on the bandwagon. There's also solar thermal energy. So that's, when the sun comes out, it gets warm outside. You can also do things on the scale of, an entire building that's covered in mirrors to concentrate the power and do high temperature chemistry. But also everybody else here is using solar thermal energy. You're not shivering in without the sun, the earth would be really cold. So we're all on board with those first two things. What's kind of new and what I want to talk about today is Voltaic Energy. And it was discovered about a century or so ago, but really came into vogue in the last 40 years and has made leaps and bounds in the last 20. And the last form of solar energy I want to talk to you about, just to open up the conversation, is the Canadian flashlight. My father, this is just a short story, but my father is from Quebec, and he has a very strong Quebecois French accent. And one day, my entire family, including my older brother, my two sisters, my mother, father, got pizza. And it came in a box like this with aluminum foil. This is just a stock photo I stole from Google. But when the pizza was gone, my older brother's putting the box away and cleaning up after dinner. And there was this, circular, round, aluminum foil covered piece of cardboard at the bottom of the box. And he motioned around the room and she caught the of the room in that aluminum foil and was shining it at my dad and said, "Look, a Canadian flashlight." And everybody thought it was hilarious except for my father. So that was really my first brush with solar energy. And yeah, kind of set things off from there. So just a quick intro to the topic. I think most folks here are familiar, but solar energy has this renewable or sustainable implication to it. When we say renewable, the reason that these are in quotes is because one thing that we're most certain of is that the sun will rise every day. And it's hard to be that certain about anything in life. But one of the things that is certain is that the sunrise might be cloudy, but bonus is that you can still make solar power even when. And then there's also this notion of sustainability. I want to emphasize that sometimes these words are misappropriated and refer to goals of sustainability, but because of the nature of solar energy technology, you're really, the most popular form of solar panels is really just melted down sand. It's silica, a really pure form of it, and metals and glass. All of these materials are highly recyclable. And so as long as you're making solar panels from recyclable materials, and as long as you're making them with renewable energy, they can actually have this feedback loop where it's entirely sustainable in an absolute sense. It's one of the cool things about renewable energy. And because we're going to talk about it later, but it's also local, right? It can be right in the backyard, and it's the cheapest power that has existed in the history of humanity, which is a bonus, but it's also because of that renewable and sustainable aspect. So kind of self-fulfilling in that way. This is a graph of a solar installation that I installed in 2016. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how, you see on the third day there, this is actually pretty recent. So June 1st is at the center of the graph. And you can see that on the day of the first, it was probably pretty cloudy, but still some energy was made. Whereas in the other day, there may be some transient clouds. So even though solar energy is highly reliable and ubiquitous, it is everywhere on the planet, with the exception of the Arctic Circle, sometimes of the year, but for everybody, the sun shines. Sometimes it shines stronger in some places than others, etc. But everybody gets some sun. The other aspect to solar energy that's more challenging to work with is that it's transient. So when you're working with electricity, if you don't use it right when it's made, you either have to store it or you lose it. So as you can see in the graph, there's some places during the day where no solar is made, and that's night, right? It's pretty obvious. But I think most people in the room are comfortable with having lights at night, using electricity at night, and that isn't a strong match with how solar is generated, only during the day. So solar tends to couple well with types of energy storage to shift power. And we can talk about that a little bit more in depth on this slide. So in the center of the slide, you see what is the typical solar generation during the day. You have this bell curve shape. This is obviously contrasting to the previous slide where you see there's some intermittent clouds. This is a perfectly clear day. And then the curve in blue shows how people typically use energy. In the morning, they get up, they use appliances at home to make breakfast. They maybe take a shower that's hot water, which may use electricity. If it's not using electricity, it's using some other form of energy, right? And then as people leave their home and go to work, you actually have a net reduction in the amount of electricity that's being used because people are in common spaces. And then the same thing happens when people come home, they do laundry, they watch TV, they do these energy intensive activities before going to bed. And it's that mismatch between how energy is made and the nature of electricity that requires some storage. But this is all in the context of solar energy being the cheapest energy in the history of the world. If anybody here receives an electric bill in Colorado, you're probably getting charged between 11 and 18 cents per kilowatt hour. And about half of that is in the generation. So the cost of the electricity, and half of it is in the distribution, the lines that bring it to your house. So if there's anybody who's waiting for the price of solar energy to come down, the time is now, because it's already the cheapest energy that the world has ever seen, as long as you take over the life cycle of a solar installation. It's not only a good deal for our wallets, it's a good deal for the environmental implications as well. And I'll get into those a little bit more, but I just want to talk about how we can shift this excess generation here using energy storage. So if we talk about 20 cents per kilowatt hour for generation in blue in this graph, that's the cost to make power. The cost to store power is about 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So for every little bit above of solar generation, solar power that's made, that's here labeled as excess, that's above the curve of generation, you either have to use it at the time, or you're storing it or losing it. So it's really ideal if you could, choose a situation where you're using power as it's available. But incrementally, your cost of storage is at the moment higher than your cost of generation. And that's a changing story, but it's part of the mix right now. And that's reflective of current lithium-ion technologies. And just by the nature of storage, you lose 5 to 10% of that energy. So again, really beneficial if you can use electricity as it's being made. So I wanted to talk about a couple of different ways that solar can be set up so that you can have some of the benefits of storage and some of the benefits of the low cost of generation. So typically when we're talking about renewable energy systems in general, but also in solar, we're talking about grid connected or on grid or grid tied systems and off grid systems or microgrid systems. In the grid tied scenario in green, you typically have some solar panels making electricity that goes to an inverter. That inverter takes the direct current power that's made from the solar panels to the alternating current power that we use in our homes. So it's just a conversion. And that's a unidirectional process in an on-grid system. There's no storage that's present in the system. So the only way for it to go is either through the home, through your utility meter and back to the grid, or being consumed in the home. So during the day, you're usually a net exporter of solar power. So you'd go from solar panels to the inverter to the home and then back to the grid. And at night, of course, your solar power wouldn't be making energy. So you'd be consuming power. And that power would come from the grid through your meter and into the home. So in some ways, the grid can look like a form of energy storage because of this concept of net metering, where you're generating excess power during the day, and at night, you're consuming more power than you're producing because solar is not working. And then at the end of the day, week, month, year, you want the total amount of electricity that you've used to be zero or near zero. In the instance where during the day you're generating more power than you consume, that's typically consumed by your neighbors for a small scale system. So even though at night you're exporting what would be considered dirty power, you are also offsetting the power that your neighbors would otherwise be using as dirty power during the day. So there are some pros and cons to this, but that is one system that's a little bit more cost effective, that doesn't require the additional cost of this energy storage. So the stacked bar to the far right, and you're only looking at the generation type of price tag. What the Ecovillage is moving towards, and what I typically recommend is I'll go through an off-grid system first. So an off-grid system isn't exactly the same, except for your inverter has this additional capability of pushing power into and out of a battery bank. Really, there's two different functions happening inside that box, but the important aspect is that there's some reservoir that you're putting power into and taking power out of. And then there's a generator noted on this graphic that I stole off of Google, but I typically do not recommend a generator because that is the dirtiest power on the planet in terms of emissions, particulate matter, and sulfur emissions. It's just not great. So when you have the option, typically I recommend a hybrid system. So what a hybrid system does is, instead of having either an on-grid or an off-grid system shown here, you would have what's shown in the off-grid regime, except you'd also have this bidirectional functionality of the grid. That's how the Ecovillage has been set up to date. We're still working on deploying energy storage, but the system has the capability in the future to incorporate energy storage so that the battery can be charged from solar that's produced during the day and offset consumption at night. So this off-grid regime or a hybrid regime has the ability to have energy independence, but if you're entirely off-grid, you also have to have energy accountability. So there's only as much power as you've generated, and no more. So a lot of us are used to just turning on a light switch and not having accountability for the consequences of using power, other than a bill at the end of the month which for most Americans is marginal compared to, for example, the cost of rent. In an off-grid scenario where you'd really be responsible for your energy independence, there's a lot more consequences there. So you typically spend a lot more time thinking about how you use energy, which results in how you use energy, and typically a reduction in how much energy you use, because it is more expensive to use more energy. So that type of mindset about being conscious of consumption, not just in, solar energy or energy that you're using from the grid, but also in all of the things that people consume, really drives the current situation that we are at with energy and consumption in the US. I think most folks in the room are familiar that the United States, on average, consumes about twice as much per capita as of energy and also consumables as most of the developed world, and vastly more than less developed nations. So what's in this image is just a snapshot of the grid mix. So we have all these different sources of energy. There's from bottom to top, hydro, other renewables, nuclear energy, wind, solar, which you can see is just a little slice here. This is through 2020. That picture is changing. Coal energy, fossil gas, so that would be your natural gas, petroleum, and then that top pink line is energy imports, and those are typically hydro from Canada, as well as, there's a typically the thickness of that line in the future is hydro power coming from Canada. So just talking about this a little bit, you see that on the bottom, hydro is relatively flat. And that's partially because of the regulations that have come into place with water sources. When we try to extract hydropower, it has this unintended consequence of, changing habitats, and particularly for types of species like sturgeon, salmon that migrate from the sea to freshwater. So hydro has stayed flat. Nuclear has been increasing, then stayed flat. But the few items in this picture that we see are increasing are solar, wind, and fossil gas, where fossil gas is really offsetting the amount of coal that has been consumed, and in addition, taking up the amount of energy increase that is being consumed by the country as a whole. So if we look from 1950 to 2020, a span of 70 years, we've gone from 300 terawatt hours per year consumption to over 4,000. So we're talking about more than a 10x increase in the amount of energy that's consumed by the nation. Part of that is just population increase, but it's also reflects a quality of life change in how people interact with energy. So the expectations that people had in 1950 for their energy supply are really different than they are today. And I think that the biggest takeaway from this image here is that, what would be most people's grandparents in this story, who are our age in the 50s, their consumption looked a lot different, but they still had pretty high quality of life. So we can make choices about the types of energy that we consume. So I'll get into that a little bit more, and maybe not get into some of the details that I mentioned here. You can come back if there are questions about how the grid works, things like that. But this is just a snapshot of what the grid looks like today, with that increasing solar, increasing wind, and increasing fossil gas component. So I wanted to talk about who's really using this increased amount of power. So in the bottom graph here, you see the users of power by the percentage of power that they consume. So in residential and commercial sense, it has stayed relatively flat for the last 20 years, the percentage of consumption, but population has increased and the overall amount of consumption has increased. So if we were to look at a graph, this would still be that wedge shape if we were looking at total amount of consumption. Really the biggest growing portions and the big movers in this graph are transport, industrial applications, and electric power consumption. And what solar PV really addresses is this electric power consumption picture, and through electric vehicles can also address transportation. So in the entire energy mix, when we're looking at the entire energy mix, there's a lot of places where solar can reduce the impact of the activities that people are presently doing without even considering how things could be done differently to reduce the impact in the first place. So it's always an uncomfortable question to ask: what are you willing to give up for an impact? But before we even get to that conversation, there's potential for electrification and renewables to make an impact that's on the scale of 2/3 of the energy consumption that people use presently. And then I guess the other takeaway message here is that, you know, as an individual, we're mostly represented by this residential component, but the consumption activities that we have for goods, transportation like flights, versus, you know, taking your car versus taking the bus, these are the choices that we can make that can make an impact on consumption before we even talk about the generation picture. So empowering each one of you to look at your own choices and be cognizant of consumption as it revolves around energy, because really using less has the same impact as generating more. And that ties back into this slide. When you're in an off-grid scenario, you really have to do that accounting for yourself to know how much energy you're using and plan around energy use. Whereas now, most of us don't think twice before we switch and we just consume electricity via lighting, or turn on the hot water and consume electricity through that means. And all of these activities should really be more conscious than they presently are. And that, again, has the same impact as a generation picture. So empowering each one of you to think about how you can make changes in your own lives to reflect those things. So the question comes: what can you do to improve the picture of how people use and interact with energy? The first thing is talk to people about it. So, you know, I'm trying to do that here. I'm talking to a group about sustainability in the context of energy, and how they use energy, how they interact with energy, so that you can go back to those consumption habits and even consumables purchases, like, you know, buying local versus international or other side of the country type groceries or things of that nature. Those have an energy price tag associated with them that's different than the price tag that you might see per, you know, unit of tomatoes, for example. Another thing that you can do, if you really want to put your money where your mouth is to own your own renewable energy system, or join a community energy solar or wind co-op. So a renewable energy system typically requires property ownership of some kind, but a community energy solar or wind co-op membership only requires that you have a utility bill that you pay. So what you can do is join a co-op, and it's very easy to do. You can just type in, Colorado Community Energy Solar Cooperative or Community Energy Solar Membership. And there's a plethora of websites that come up. And instead of paying, for example, Mountain View Electric every month, you would pay the Community Energy Solar Group every month for the amount of electricity that you use. And by having that difference in accounting, it really drives the economic scenario for more adoption of renewables. And I also say that typically when you join a community energy solar or wind co-op, your electricity bill usually goes down. And that's because of what we talked about, is that solar and wind are the cheapest forms of energy generation ever, and will continue to be so just because of the cost of fossil fuels. If fossil fuels cost nothing, then they would be more competitive. But energy, solar and wind in combination with energy storage is the cheapest form of energy that the world has ever seen. There are some issues with that in the context of like seasonal changes when you live at high latitudes, but for most of us who live at mid latitudes or lower, it's really an elegant solution for everyone to be part of a energy transition. And the third thing that you can do are start to look at efficiency and electrification of the different types of energy you interact with. So if you're currently living in a home, you own that home that has, a propane hot water heater, and then it breaks and you need to replace it, consider replacing with an electric one. The same thing goes with propane heat. The same thing goes with, your vehicle. All of the things that use fuels can be typically converted to, with some exceptions, can be converted to electric appliances. And then in so doing, you're preparing yourself for a future grid where there's a higher renewables mix. So even though they're higher efficiency and they will actually save energy today, they will also have lower carbon impact in the future in a scenario where we have more wind and solar, more carbon-free energy in the grid mix to start with. That can really drive the, double down on your gains for doing that electrification. So for example, electric vehicles are about 2 times as efficient as gas vehicles, just purely from an efficiency perspective. So even if you plug your car into the electric grid and you're using the same electricity that's being distributed to homes, that it's almost entirely a fossil mix with a small percentage of renewables, you're still going about twice as far per unit energy than your counterparts that would be in a fossil fuel vehicle. So talk to people about sustainability, look at your own habits and purchases and where you put your money, and then take action by joining a co-op, and when you can make choices about, again, your consumption of goods that govern how you use energy. So I think I'll just, at this time, move to a Q&A. I was originally planning on being able to walk outside on land and do a walkthrough of the PV system that was there. So we're a bit short, but happy to take any questions that people have. If they're really specific or really general about things I presented or things I didn't, happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. I was thinking maybe we could even do a little like short Q&A interview dialogue and then open to group questions if you're feeling it.
Yeah, I'm ready for that.
Okay.
Actually, after I take a sip here, I'll be ready for that.
In fact, I'm gonna get water too.
Do you want some of mine?
I would love some of yours.
Oh no, it's potentially COVID water. So
I would not love some of yours. So for those who missed it, Ramon mentioned that Rab and he had intentionally planned their slides to follow the same format. So that's a win.
really use the same designer feature in PowerPoint for your slide size.
Yes, he did. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, clearly it must be the most attractive version then.
So let's see. My thoughts are only partially organized, but I wanted to take over for a short dialogue before we open the Q&A, just because first of all, I'm curious to go into a little bit more like the story behind the process here for people's awareness, and also what happened with the car and what the possibilities are there, what the needs are there. Not that any of that is, finalized or that there's a confirmed plan, because things could go either way, but just I think it would be great to have a natural conversation with the group here about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we're also getting a tiny bit of wind, so there might be a pause for windproofing a little. And then let's see, there's several other things I just wanted to mention, but maybe we can start with that, and we could also hear from you about like what it is we could look like if you were doing the walkthrough here, in case we have time to do it ourselves. You could give us a little bit of a virtual preview in case people even just want to walk themselves through, probably without touching anything would be the request.
Ideally, yeah. I think we can start with the car. So are you still all seeing my screen? Because I messed up.
No, we're not on screen share right now.
Okay, great.
But you can.
So yeah, starting with the car, I guess there's a bit of a story there. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar, but when I was helping to install the solar PV energy system that is currently, right next to where you are now, I got in an accident where I got T-boned, and I was driving an electric car, and I was very lucky to get out of that situation mostly unscathed, without really very many long-term consequences. So that was good. But at the end, was left with this electric vehicle that, I had planned on driving for a really long time, and was clearly at the end of its life for being driven. But after inspecting it and testing it a little bit, found that the batteries that were in the vehicle were still entirely functional and that there was nothing wrong with them. So the intention was, switched from having that be a mode of transport to be a mode of energy storage that could be utilized in order to go through that regime that I spoke about in an off-grid situation, or in this case, a hybrid situation, where you can store the energy you make and self-consume it so that you know where your energy is coming from. So that's a little bit of the backstory there. And there's a lot of new technology that are coming very soon in EVs and grid integration of electric vehicles that allows you to push and pull power from electric vehicles. And our plan at the moment is to push and pull power from that electric vehicle on a daily basis to offset what dirty power is consumed at night. Does that answer some of the questions that?
Yeah. So essentially, Rab came here to help us out with installing that whole solar array. Has everyone seen the solar array out there? Has anyone not seen it? Okay, you can see the solar array over there, just kind of near the other fence line. And when Rab was here helping us set that up, we went through all kinds of different processes. So just maybe to give people a little bit of a sense of what it was like and what it was all about. Essentially, we decided to do a ground mount. So we had to basically fill several buckets with lots and lots of soil from the land to weigh down the buckets that are designed to hold the panels. So that was kind of the manual labor portion for those of us who don't know how to do the electrical portion. Were you about to say something, Rob?
Yeah, and I would like to speak to that because usually when you see, pictures of solar arrays, you see big structures that are made out of metal that hold the panels up and may or may not track the sun, but they're usually heavily structural. They use concrete and steel. And in this case, we're using a plastic bucket that is recyclable. It's one of the highest recyclable forms of plastic. It's polypropylene. So it's your same stuff as your milk jugs and just dirt. So if there ever came a time when this array was uninstalled, all you'd have to do is dump out the dirt and recycle the buckets for the structural component of it, which feeds back into how much impact and energy went into creating the array in the first place. It's really there was a lot of sweat that went into it, but there was a lot less materials because of the approach.
Yeah, that kind of just gets, I just wanted to illustrate from our experience that, like a big part of making these things work is just a collective effort, and it takes like a real commitment to just get things done with more hands on deck and following through and doing the work, but then it happens and it works great. So as opposed to just having someone do it for you. So I think it's also great when people can have someone else install their solar for them. So I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying that that's how we did it here, is like there's a certain responsibility of actually working on it together and helping out that I experienced. And then while Rab was here with the big car accident that happened, which is the big totally crashed car that you can see in front of the barn, essentially I don't know how much money we need to raise. One sec, we're having a lot of wind. Can you close the door? Thank you. So I don't know how much money we need to raise, or if you want to go into like the essentials of what that new technology is, when it's coming out, if it already came out, and what it will allow us. Today was supposed to be the calmest and sunniest day, but I guess there was a change of plans.
It's a good day for wind energy.
Yeah, well, okay, that brings up another really good point, so maybe you could speak to both of those, because I know you were talking about wind with us.
Yeah, so solar has a different intermittency profile than wind, right? So the sun comes up, you have energy, the sun goes down, you don't. It's more predictable that way, but it's also impacted by weather. So if you live in a place that's has more cloudy days than sunny days, which, Colorado is not one of those places, but if you do, the energy resource from the sun might be impacted. In a scenario where you have wind, it's entirely driven by weather. So you may have times where you're producing more power than you can use for days or weeks on end. And then you may also have gaps in how much power you can produce for the same type of time period. So it's really location dependent on what type of resource is available. the location we're all at now actually has a lot of both wind and solar. But so it comes down to, the choice really comes down to the local resource that's available, and what is willing to be taken on in terms of the entire picture of installing it and maintaining it. In the case of wind, it requires maintenance because it has moving components, whereas solar generally doesn't require maintenance because it's stationary. It's an electrical reaction as a result of being present in sun. So really low maintenance for solar, which is one of its benefits. It can really sit in a homeowner's backyard for 30, 40, and we even have 50-year-old PV arrays that are still working now without them really doing anything.
And so basically, I mean, I know there's even technology on the market that allows people to combine in some small scale, at least wind and solar in similar modules and inversion processes together. So I just wanted to like mention that just as a thought process, of like the observation of, okay, here we are on this land, things that you might think, oh, I don't like that it's so freaking hot and sunny all the time, or I don't like how freaking strong and intense this wind gets so often. You can totally flip the script and look at the same exact problem as a solution and say, wow, that incredible amount of sunlight combined with that incredible strength of wind that we're getting here on this land could be put together to generate an incredible amount of free energy. Not free, but once you install it, you're not really paying for the wind to blow or the sun to shine, but they're doing it a lot. So in that sense, like just kind of transmuting what seems to be a problem into realizing, wow, these are really valuable resources we have here, that the wind blows so strong and the sun shines so strong, and the fact that they usually take turns really makes it so that you might generate power in a more balanced way throughout the day and throughout the year and the night and so on. So I agree.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then,
so,
yeah, go ahead.
In speaking to a type of solar energy that heat, if it's really hot in your home, one way to harness solar energy in a passive way is to plant deciduous trees. So during the summer, you'll get a lot of shade on your house, which will either cool your house or not heat it up as much, rather, or reduce the load on your air conditioning so that you're not cooling it as much. And in the winter, when the leaves fall down, you actually still get the solar gain in the winter for heating your house. So you can really, work even with, non-tech approach to solar energy to realize some gains. And I think, actually there's an initiative to get a little bit of land transformational aspects happening at the property that might drive some of those gains too. Maybe you could speak about the tree planting and how that might have some other benefits.
Yeah, we had a big presentation yesterday from Nicole about our plans with tree planting here, and soil remediation and forestation efforts and so on. But if you wanted to go into any of your own perspectives on that, feel free. And then the other points I was asking about was I don't know if you've already spoken to it fully, but essentially I wanted to mention that car out front that's totaled, that was Rab's, if we keep it rather than selling it or giving it back to Rab or whatever, then we got this really good deal on this really powerful battery that's inside of it, and this new technology that Rab is kind of on the in the know on the leading edge of that technology that's coming out would allow us, I believe, to essentially use the full storage capacity of that battery, which is absolutely enormous and goes well beyond the existing structure's needs, as well as the existing solar arrays capacities, and essentially allows us to use all of that storage space even with our current setup, without even taking the battery out of the car, just kind of removing or remodeling the broken parts and being able to even drag it around the land in neutral. And for example, plug it into a stage for HeartFire Festival and power the event plugged into the car remotely from the solar panels on the other side of the field. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to like how much money it would cost or when we could do that or how that technology works. You know, just in case people are inspired by it or interested in learning more about it or contributing towards that or chiming in, because right now we're not able to do that and there's a chance we'll have to sell the car back to Rab. But the idea is just that if we can keep it, that would allow our Ecovillage to go more entirely off grid, and the panels we already invested in making the panel set up in a modular way that allows us to expand and allows us to add a battery and be self-reliant. So if you wanted to speak to the benefit or any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the energy storage that's present in the car is 60 kilowatt hours. So just, you don't really have to think about the units, but just think about the number 60. The typical consumption of a home is in between 10 and 30 kilowatt hours per day. So during the day and during the night, the total consumption is 30 kilowatt hours. If you say that solar, takes a good portion of that away because you can use the solar power directly, then the amount of storage that you have, for the location that there's at now on the current use profile is in between 2 and 4 days, depending on how it's used. If you do business as usual and run your washing machine and things like that, you could be off grid for 2.5 days. If you're really sparing with it, you could be, 10 kilowatt hours a day gets you almost to a week without using any electricity from the grid. So that's kind of the scale of the energy storage potential that's there. And then in terms of the economic value of that, I talked about how current products on the market are about 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour consumed of storage. So every time you charge and discharge that, there's a significant savings, and the present market value of just the battery that's in the vehicle is in excess of $10,000. So even though my insurance didn't think it was worth that much, it has a lot of value, but also a lot of potential to be still used instead of going back to be recycled. So, reduce, reuse, recycle. Unfortunately, I dropped the ball on reduce by crashing it, but hopefully it can be reused instead of recycled.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess we can open it up to questions from the audience. I don't know if people got a sense or if you wanted to say anything more about what we can look at when people, whether together or individually, go tour the property a little bit, or at least walk along the solar array. The one thing I mentioned was the buckets that we filled with soil ourselves and the community effort that went into that. And the other thing I can mention is the lack of expertise that was required for us to also help trench, which is a relatively simple process in which you can actually see the remnants of the trench itself. So I think these are really valuable educational things, observations, experiences, at least for me, myself, even just learning a little bit about construction, like how much of it might be with something like electric or plumbing, digging a narrow, long hole, and how important that is. And it's simple and it's something you can do yourself. So that's something we did do ourselves, and you could rent a trencher or you could even get a trenching shovel, which we did on a 4-foot hole all the way into the basement for some plumbing. So essentially, like, it's just a matter of making this long hole of a certain depth and running the electrical wire along it all the way from the panels to the inverter under the house. So people can actually see that line still right now, if they wanted to take a look at how the solar is installed, at least in that aspect of it, and how simple it is to basically do something that people charge a lot of money for, but that you just, as long as somebody knows how to put the inverter on and how to put the panels in and where to place them, there is one aspect that, just like filling the buckets with the dirt, removing the dirt from the trench so that the wire can connect those two parts of the system, is the other thing I'd mentioned that you could look for. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah, I do want to, there is definitely a lot of just activities that are can be done by pretty much anybody without a lot of expertise. But I do want to emphasize from a safety perspective that just like anything electrical, it has the potential to any electrical appliance in a home under the wrong conditions has the potential to kill somebody. So from a safety perspective, it's really important that when you're working with electricity, you know what you're doing, you're comfortable with working with electricity. Even in that context, accidents still do happen. There are electrical workers that have accidents throughout the industry. But yeah, it's really important that if you're taking on a project like a solar project, even if it's really small scale, that you either are or you become what is called an electrical qualified person. And sometimes that can just be, spending 2 days in a course to become familiar with it, and all the way up to spending, multiple years under an electrician as an apprentice before getting your electrical license. So there's a lot of different scope of knowledge there, but from a safety perspective, that's really important. And then what I would say is also is that even just your typical solar panel, your skin has enough resistance if it's unbroken on average to resist about 30 volts. The solar panels that are installed here under sunlight have about 40 volts. So if you touched one of the panels, you would really have to try. But if you shorted the electrical circuit with the panels that are even not plugged into each other, there's the potential there to be harmful. And then as they are connected presently, there's usually, like on a day like today, it's probably 350 volts, but on like a cold spring day in March, that's around like 0 degrees Celsius, and but the sun is still bright and shining, it could be up to 500 volts. So it's not for the faint of heart if it's something that's new for you. But coming back to what you said, Yasha, about the the aspects that are really user friendly, a lot of solar panels just come plug and play. So you have these two cores, you just stick them together. That allows you to create that additional voltage in series that then has some added benefits for solar energy, like your wire size is governed by your voltage, right? So if we think about power, it's in two components, current and voltage. And the higher your voltage is, the lower your current is, and they're directly related. So if you're able to go to a higher voltage by plugging your solar panels in together, your wire that you're needing to transmit that power is smaller, and that saves you dollars. As Alec has recently found out, there are advantages to things like that. And yeah, so there are options out there to have really plug and play type systems that are that require less electrical knowledge in order to use safely and deploy safely. And there's the entire regime of having installing a type of system that like tracks the sun and uses a motor to do that, and requires a foundation that's like 10 feet deep, all the way to something like this, where it's really just a molded plastic bucket filled with dirt that you put a panel on top of and stick a clip in, and then it's safe from the wind. It'll never blow away on you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Yeah, kind of last thing I'll say, and let's open it up. I'm just reflecting on kind of the essence of what's sticking with me for the presentation, from your presentation. And I guess I just want to say, like, a lot of these things, they just feel related to what you just learned by living in community, in a certain sense. Even like you're mentioning, and both resource conservation, as far as like maybe you dry your clothes in the air instead of using a dryer or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Or maybe you want to take a cool shower instead of a hot one every day. And maybe that helps it last 3 minutes instead of 30, so that other people can have a turn taking a shower too. Or it might be, even like somebody brought watermelon in just now, and I took a piece, and then I intentionally stopped myself from taking a second piece, because by the time some people came in who I wanted to pass the watermelon to, almost all the watermelon was gone. And so sharing resources too, like, just comes up naturally in community, and that I think is a great microcosm of learning for actually kind of being able to sustain our global community, like both you and Ramon mentioned. The difference in power consumption in the northern and southern hemispheres and so on. And so, yeah, I just wanted to point out how that all connects, and even your point about expertise and safety feels really relevant to me, to what you learn in community, as far as like my point being, there are things you can do. It might sound glorious to like help install a solar system, but it might just require you to shovel the dirt for 3 days. So if you want to like do what you're ready to do while observing what else there is to learn, but respect that maybe there's someone who actually already apprenticed and already knows how to do it safely. And just respecting different people's skill sets and expertise as contributions in a humble way is a big part of community too. So just some reflections, and if anybody wants to share anything or ask anything, they can maybe come up here, simpler. Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Furo.
Hello. I can.
Okay, so I have 2 practical questions. One is,
Great.
what is the best way to clean solar panels, like with snow, mud, dust, stuff like that, so that you don't scratch it or mess it up in any way?
Yeah. So usually, with maybe the exception of the winter months, the best way to clean solar panels is just by taking a bucket or a garden hose and spraying them. So that has a non-touch aspect to it, because when you get dust on a solar array, you have the potential. Dust is abrasive, right? So especially like if you have really sandy ground, that is abrasive. So if you tried to wipe it away, it would over time create scratches, and that can lead to less power being produced in the future. So even though you might get a gain in the moment, over the life of a solar array, it could be really impactful to how much is made. And then in the winter months, I think the best approach that I typically tell homeowners, if you're in a grid connected scenario, and there are solar panels on your roof, for example, the best thing to do is to just let it melt. And in Colorado at low elevations, that really only lasts a day or two. Usually the snow doesn't stick around that long. And usually what happens is that snow sheds from a solar array. So it doesn't usually just melt. It usually melts to the point where there's an interface of water between the snow and the solar panel, and then it slides off. So what can happen is that at towards the end of winter, you may get like a pile of snow that builds up in the front of the solar panels. Removing that allows that snow shedding to happen a little bit faster. But usually I tell people not to try to remove ice or snow, because yeah, ultimately the panels are glass. Even though they're rated for hail, you can still damage them with a metal shovel or something like that.
That's real. Not really bad.
I didn't catch that with the wind back.
Boom, not really bad.
A broom is better. Yeah, a broom is better, right? And so like if you're using like a cloth but really I think the best is either water or blown air, something that's a non-touch because of that abrasive quality. But yeah, I mean, like if depending on how much dust builds up, it may be worth it to use a broom.
Like Windex, is that bad?
So solar panels have this, just like the coating on your windshield in your car, there's this anti-glare coating on the windshield that allows more light to go through. So you usually don't want to use any chemical products. Water is enough. And if there's like remaining, so in wetter areas, you might get like moss or things growing like algae on the surface of the solar panels. And in that case, I would recommend power washing the modules to additionally remove that, but also still be a non-touch type of cleaning.
All right, my other question is, so at my house, I've broken, or the solar has broken, 2 TVs, a computer, a sound bar. And so, and someone was trying to explain to me like that the shape of the electricity like is more square, but then when it goes through the inverter, it like arcs and makes it more round, but that like some electronics don't, like it messes them up and then they just quit working. So I was just wondering what electronics not
Yeah.
plug into solar and how to prevent losing electronics.
Yeah, so there's a couple different answers to that. So there are 2 different ways that inverters can work. One is, well, I guess 3, but the answer to your question is really just twofold. There's alternating current, which you use in your home, and direct current that solar panels make. An inverter takes direct current and turns it into alternating current. There's 2 forms that inverters do that in. They can do it in a pure sine wave. So that means that the form of the energy is really smooth in its alternating fashion. And it can do it in a modified sine wave, which is more blocky. So the types of inverters that are rated to connect with the grid, they're certified by UL listing to connect to the grid, have to be the former, the pure sine wave form of an inverter, and they have no problem interfacing with any electronics. The types of inverters that are a modified sine wave are generally cheaper. So they go all the way from the kind that you might plug into your 12-volt outlet in your car, all the way up to like big types of inverters that can run, kilowatts of equipment. And those sometimes will be a modified sine wave inverter, and they are a little bit cheaper, but they have this negative benefit of poorly interacting with some electronics. So pretty much anything that you would think of that's digital, so plugs directly into the wall. So usually like laptop computers are actually DC. You have that like power brick in between the computer and the wall. Those types of devices are safe. But things like LEDs are, you can burn out LEDs with modified sine wave inverters. And then also some electronics that are directly using AC can get burned out. And then also alternating current motors. Any motor that uses a modified sine wave will have a shorter life too. So yeah, I would just generally frame it as electronics that doesn't have that brick in between the wall and the electronics that don't interface well with modified sine wave equipment. So it's really not a solar specific problem, but it's an inverter technology selection choice. So to get a little bit more background on where you are with your home and what things are going on there, this may not be the case for your home, but I thought that it might be. There may be some other things going on, but maybe we could dive a little deeper if you feel the need.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We should have time for maybe one or two. We have three more questions. If we keep them concise, we can do all three, I hope.
I'll do my best.
In case it gets windy, this mic goes through the speaker and to Rav, so this could help.
Hey, Rob, good to see you.
Hey, Alex.
I'm curious, because I know part of the conversation about solar technology is also life cycle analysis. So the amount of emissions and pollution and energy and just resource extraction that is involved in actually making all of the components, the solar panels themselves and so on. And I have a sense maybe that some of that might be improving, but I'm curious what you can share about that and in what ways that might be changing, because I know it might even be like more polluting for certain ways that they're manufactured over a life cycle analysis.
So the first time that I installed solar panels, which was over 10 years ago, they were about 15 to 16% efficient. So you can imagine that even if the energy to create them was the same, which is actually less now, but even if it was the same, you're getting less energy for the same amount of energy input, which is connected to that carbon footprint. So one thing that's changed is that solar panels are now between 20 and 25% efficient, whereas 10 years ago they were 15 to 16% efficient. So that changes the picture. So generally today we're talking about the amount of energy or carbon footprint that is corresponding to a solar installation is paid back in about a year and a half. It really depends on exactly where the panels come from, because there are different practices industrially in different places. But usually it's about a year and a half for the energy that went into making the product to be paid back. And then the lifetime of a solar panel, usually they're warranted for 20 to 25 years. And at my present job, we monetize or amortize the solar installation across a 30-year lifespan. And, who knows where solar will be in 30 years. Certainly has changed a lot in the last 30. So, yeah, I guess the short answer is it takes about a year and a half to get back what went into creating it in the first place.
Awesome. I have one more really quick question. In one of your slides, a big chunk was power consumption, I think, in the percentages of where energy is being used. Is that just like energy efficiency in the production of electricity, or what was that category?
Yeah, so that was about the groups that use electricity. So anomaly, it's broken into commercial, not just electricity, but all forms of energy. So anomaly is broken into residential uses, commercial uses, industrial uses, transportation, and then there was one more larger category. And then electricity, what you just mentioned. So that electricity bucket is really anyone who uses electricity. And then industrial use of power can be, thermal power, it can be natural gas directly, it can be chemical energy from fossil fuels or other products. So the point of that slide was to show that there's a lot of energy consumption happening, and electrification can allow renewables to supply that energy as opposed to continuing to use fossil fuels. So if you go from an electric vehicle or from a fossil fuel vehicle to an electric vehicle, that allows that transport component to easily be switched from a fossil source with emissions to a renewable source with nominally less emissions, right? So ultimately we have to make these systems. So because we're making them, there is an associated carbon footprint. But after that is in place, the carbon footprint is much lower and takes about 1.5 years for the trade-off to come into play. And then from there, it's 2 to 3 decades of free energy, at least from an emissions perspective.
Thank you, Rob. We had 2 quick questions to finish up. Looks like 4. Okay, come on up. Everybody who has a question, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's try to just run through them. Come on up.
All right, I'll be quick.
And then we have a very special workshop with Nick that's going to be super exciting.
On the topic of DIY and Ohm's law, is it possible for a village to build its own battery array out of common parts, like wet cells?
Absolutely. So one of the interesting aspects about batteries is that they're highly recyclable, but also reusable. So batteries that come from the automotive sector at end of life can still be used for stationary applications. And you can go to whatever level of depth that you like. So you can build an array from individual cells that are this big to individual cells that are like bigger than I can show you with my hands. Even if you're not seeing me, I guess maybe. So like individual cells the length of your finger all the way to ones that are a square the size of your arm or bigger. A lot of systems now come plug and play. Those are more expensive because they have electronics stacked on top of the actual batteries. But yeah, ultimately it's very doable. What is the missing piece is the expertise, because it's generally a new industry. So not, a lot of people have been working with cars for the last 100 years. Folks are able to fix their own cars, but they're less familiar with solar energy and renewable energy electronics. So part of that is just a skill perspective that will be increasing in time, but right now there's not as many people skilled in it as they might be skilled in fixing their own car, for example.
We looked at the evidence for how much solar would be needed to power the way of life as it is now. Would people have to reduce their energy use? And suppose we'd have to look at the different sectors, just for commercial and residential use. And can you say some about impacts of mining? Is all that's needed is making silicone for the most basic solar?
Yeah, so most solar, so I guess I'll say the first bit. Elon Musk has a really famous interview where he shows a really small corner of Arizona that's about the size of Rhode Island. And he said that if you put wall-to-wall solar panels in that zone, then you could run the entire country off of that. That's not really fair because there's a distribution issue and an energy storage issue that's there, but it really is the land area that would be required. That's true. And so to give an example that kind of sums it up, the amount of electricity that people presently use versus the amount of solar resource that hits the sun is less than 1%. So people use less than 1% of the energy that, if we harvested less than 1% of the energy that hits the sun in terms of solar energy, we could power everything that humanity uses presently. And then the second question was about mining. So the main inputs to a solar panel itself are glass, and then silica crystals, which is really sand is 80% silica crystals. And then they're also doped with phosphorus, but phosphorus is also a really common element. It's one of the nutrients that farmers monitor for agriculture. So maybe you've spoken about phosphorus more recently. And then from there, it's there's conductors themselves, copper, silver, and the metal components that go around solar panels are usually aluminum. Conductors can also be aluminum. So really, the solar technologies itself are heavily reliant on mining of metals, but metals are also infinitely recyclable compared to, and so is silica compared to things like plastics, rubbers, those types of things where they have a limited number of times that you can recycle them.
Awesome, thank you. Last question.
Hi, I wanted to share, there's something kind of strange happening in my hometown, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on it. So there is an outside company, not local, big power company who has bought up a lot of farmland in my hometown, and there is a big group of local residents, about 600 of them actually, and one of my close relatives is a part of this, and they've just been like hardcore protesting this installation of these fields of solar panels. Have you heard about anything like that happening? Is that something that's like common that people are?
Yeah, so I'm originally from upstate New York, which has a really strong agricultural history. It's also really fertile farmland. It gets like 30 inches of rain a year, and it also gets a lot of sun. And it's definitely an issue. Putting solar panels on arable land is probably a bad choice in terms of land use for people, and then also has larger ecosystem impacts. So I think that agricultural areas are not the best choice for in general. But that being said, there are instances where agriculture can exist side by side with solar arrays. So for example, in Colorado, there's actually so much sun that growth is mitigated and it dries things out. So if you are able to add shade and do grazing by sheep, or if you're able to do farming in the spatial rows of solar panels, then you're able to do a little bit of both and have mixed land use, which is really the ideal situation. You're getting twice the amount of bang for your buck. But yeah, generally speaking, it's a difficult topic because people both need food and also demand energy, whether or not they need it. So there's there's a conflict, and ultimately it's a NIMBY type of situation, right? And it's hard to be on the right side of that conversation from either perspective.
I like the idea of this sort of middle road of being able to split up the land, and where some of it can be farmland, and some of it can be used for the solar panels. Do you have any other? I would like to offer suggestions to this particular person, because they're just saying no, but not offering any kind of compromise or any other kind of any other solutions. And I mean, clearly, like, we need to start coming up with other ways for our energy. So I was wondering, do you have any other suggestions as far as what might be kind of like a middle road for that? I know you mentioned that these things can be constructed out of polypropylene and just put in the dirt, and also really concerned about the massive use of cement and metal. So like, is that doable on a large scale?
Yeah, Holy Cross Energy actually installed a commercial scale system in Colorado with exactly the product that's in the backyard there. So it can be implemented at scale with less impactful things than having cement and steel in the ground. And then I would also just point to some of the leaders in the space in terms of land use. So, for example, Hawaii is an area that's highly land constrained because they have a lot of solar resource that people are interested in using, but then they only have so much land area for agriculture. So there's land use restrictions in Hawaii that only 10% of a particular parcel can be used for solar PV modules. And I think that as more adoption comes into place, these types of regulations will be important to moderate the conversation, because ultimately a individual that's part of a municipality, unless they get a real grassroots organization happening, they don't have as much of a voice as a large corporation. So there's a conflict of power between individual interests, who some might point and say, that's a NIMBY sentiment and not in my backyard type of sentiment, where it's still a good transition, versus, there are real impacts to land in terms of putting concrete in it. Concrete makes land more basic in general, which can have long-term impacts for agricultural areas. There are options around that where you can just drive piles and not use concrete. But yeah, it's there's not a clear answer to how it's done. It's really location dependent about the methods that can be used to try to make everybody happy.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rab. Ramon has a last question in the chat. Any resource recommendations about solar life cycle, NIMBY, municipalization, etc.? Is that
Oh, do you want to jump on for a second and put it into a longer sentence form?
Yeah, I'm just first of all really appreciating your presentation. And I'm just wondering if you have any like, I'm a teacher. I'm like looking to spread this stuff. If you have any resources, really appreciate the piece about the solar life cycle, because I hear a lot of criticism about solar's capacity to actually provide energy on a large scale going forward. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if you have any resources about its like the whole life cycle of solar, any resources about it being scaled to the municipal level, and any resources about like some of these conflicts that happen between, the ones that Lo just mentioned. Yeah.
In terms of pointing you to resources, it's more difficult. It's like in a dialogue, but yeah, happy to connect with you offline to point you towards individual resources. I would say that generally, if you want to Google something, NREL is a very reliable source of information. So they have a lot of these life cycle analyses that have been published, and it's coming from a worldwide leader in the space. So it's not going to be a biased form of information. Yeah, in terms of the life cycle aspect, and how I think one of the major criticisms of solar energy, wind energy, and renewables in general is that has to do with their intermittency. So sometimes the wind blows, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's not. And because of that intermittency of power versus the expectation of individuals to have power all the time, there's a mismatch. And the criticism is that we can only get to a certain penetration or a certain percentage of adoption of these renewables before that becomes an issue. Presently, we're below 5% of those intermittent renewable resources. So if you take wind and add it up, and you take solar and add it up, it's about 4.5% of the energy mix that is used in the grid as a whole today. That is highly variable across geographic location. So upstate New York, for example, has about 40% renewable mix, with a lot of that coming from hydro. California has about a 15 to 20% solar mix. And well, I would say, yeah, 10 to 15% solar mix. And that's drives a lot of grid troubles for them because of the intermittency aspect of the resource. So that was one of the reasons that I keyed in on the generation in time of solar energy versus the energy storage component, and how those two things really have to go together in order to be a complete solution for how people typically demand that their power is today. You flip the switch and it comes on. That you know, when the power goes off, most people view that as a huge inconvenience. So yeah, going forward in the future, energy storage is going to be a large issue until somebody figures out the next new energy innovation that propels us past these intermittency issues. So those types of storage can be batteries, but then they can also be compressed air. You can also pump water uphill and then let it fall back downhill through a turbine. There's a lot of forms of energy storage besides just batteries that can get us to, storing what we need on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thank you again, Rab. Thank you, Rab, not just for this amazing presentation and sharing this information with more people, but also for the inspiring collaboration with Sanctorum Ecovillage that we're so grateful for. Our mission is peace.